If I had a nickel for every time somebody went missing on the Ojai Lakes Trail in Mount Rainier National Park, I would have 2 nickels. And honestly, the nickel collection is quite large at this point. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Mount Rainier is a place of many stories. To the native Coast Salish people who have lived around the mountain they call some variant of Tahoma for untold ages, it was a place of great spiritual significance, with stories dating back to the last glacial age. To those who live around it now, it's a place of reverence for nature, guarded by the dedicated rangers of the National Park Service. To a select group of people who watch YouTube, it's a place where a guy got chased through the night by someone who kept asking how to get to Bell's Canyon, and for most of that same group, it's a place where a number of unexplainable disappearances have occurred over the last 75 years. We've talked about a few of those disappearances in the past. Last year, we covered the stories of Eric Lewis, Lowell Lynn, Joseph Wood Jr., and Marcella Ramisky, and that video is linked in the description for those who haven't seen it. Earlier this year, we looked at the Bell's Canyon story as well, along with a few other similar ones from that area. So I'm not sure how it is that I missed 2 of the more strange cases of people who have gone missing on Mount Rainier, Chet Hansen and Karen Sykes. Not only are these 2 stories where there's really a lack of an official explanation for how the individuals got lost, but their disappearances occurred along the same length of the same trail on Rainier's eastern slopes. Chet Hansen would never be found, leaving behind a car full of questions and no sign of where he'd gone, and 17 years later, Karen Sykes would vanish, only to turn up in an inexplicable location. What caused each of them to lose the trail? Why did they fail to get back? And what really happened to them? We'll get into the details of each case and dive into the possible answers to those questions, but first let me tell you about one of the sponsors who makes it possible for us to research these cases with the sincerity and depth I try to bring to each one. I'm talking about Holtzkern, which is actually one of my favorite companies to work with. Specializing in jewelry and, of course, watches, Holtzkern's artisans blend wood, stone, and metal into truly unique, handcrafted pieces which are sure to impress. Everything comes out of their workshops in Austria in small batch quantities, always made by craftsmen and never mass-produced. So every time you purchase a Holtzkern watch, ring, necklace, or bracelet, you know that you're one of a select few people in the world with a piece like yours. And even then, it's unique. Each design uses real gems, pearls, stones, or even things like peacock feathers, or in this case, leaves. So no 2 models are ever exactly alike. I have one that I keep for myself, and then I also love to give these as gifts for birthdays and holidays, because they work for any kind of occasion, whether it's casual or formal. I'm even considering one of their rings for my wedding band, pending the all clear from the future Mrs. Mattis. Holtzkern also offers free worldwide shipping from their warehouse in Vienna, and they've already worked customs fees into their pricing, so there's no surprises on the shipping screen. And if you buy using our code, you'll get 15% off on top of free shipping that arrives in just 5 to 9 business days. That 15% applies to the entire website, so you can try out multiple pieces and different types of jewelry to build your own sets to work for any occasion. So if you're ready to stand out sustainably, head to holtzkern.com/lorelodge and use code LORELODGE at checkout to get 15% and free shipping when you place your order. On the morning of November 12, 1997, Wilkeson, Washington resident Chet Hansen should have clocked into his job with Alaska Airlines at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Several hours after his shift was supposed to start, however, his colleagues had seen no sign of him, nor had he called in to let his employer know that he wouldn't be in that day. According to papers like The Olympian, his boss knew something wasn't right and called police to report Chet missing. And if that sounds unusual to you, you're not alone, because I also felt like there had to be something missing from the story there. Unfortunately, there is literally no explanation as to why his boss assumed he had to be missing. At least not from what made it to the papers. The National Park Service files, on the other hand, are considerably more detailed and make quite a bit more sense. And I have to give credit to David Politis where it's due, because without him, I wouldn't have access to those documents. Since I do have them, though, I was able to work out what the real story was here. According to Ranger Nina Stevens, the day before Chet was reported missing, he had called to let his employer know that he wouldn't be in that day. That was Tuesday the 11th. But he was still expected for his shift on the following afternoon. When he didn't arrive, his boss called Chet's home, which he still shared with his parents, Rick and Karen Hansen, but they had no idea where their son was either. When his mother had last seen him on Tuesday morning around 7 o'clock a.m., he'd just gotten off the phone with work to tell them that he wouldn't be coming in. She'd overheard that call, and Chet had either already told her or told her in that moment that he planned to go hiking that day and expected to be home for dinner. Now, Chet actually did not return home that night, but his parents weren't particularly worried. Cell phones weren't nearly as common in 1997 as they are today, and Chet was a grown man. Rick and Karen later told police that they initially thought he might have decided to spend the night at a friend's place, but they became concerned when his boss called sometime after 2:30 p.m. on Wednesday the 12th. Not making it home was one thing, but not showing up to work without calling in first seems to have been out of character. Still, they held off on filing a police report and instead gathered family and friends to go search for their missing son. Sometime that afternoon or evening, members of that search party located Chet's car, parked at the Deer Creek Trailhead, which is now the Ojai Lakes Trailhead. It's unclear exactly when this happened, but it must have been before 12:57 a.m. on Thursday the 13th, which is when the Hansens finally reported Chet missing. By that time, they had already notified the Park Service, and Ranger Stevens' account says that the search was scheduled to begin at first light. Ranger John Madden, the first to hear of Chet's disappearance, wrote in his report that the search teams were dispatched by 3 a.m. on the 13th, and that the search was fully underway 3 hours later, something for which they deserve the utmost respect when so many agencies of the time would have told the Hansens to wait another day or so to see if their son was just off on a bender somewhere, like the Wasilla, Alaska police suggested when 15-year-old Michael Palmer disappeared 2 years later. And yes, we have a video on the disappearance of Michael Palmer and his older brother Chuck Palmer, who disappeared 10 years apart, on our channel, and it is weird. Leaving that aside, in Chet's case, it did help that the Park Service wasn't alone at the scene that night. At 2:30 in the morning, Chet's friends and family were still at the trailhead, where Ranger Max Hall was doing his best to convince them to wait until daylight to head back up the trail. Rangers Hugh Naring, John Madden, Rich Leckleitner, and Debbie Brenchley joined him half an hour later to find that Ranger Hall had succeeded in his task for the most part, but had been unable to keep a couple of volunteer teams from heading into the Kotsuk Creek and Chinook Creek drainages. Ranger Naring managed to prevent anyone else from striking out in the dark without proper guidance, but he didn't turn them away completely. Instead, he assigned groups of 4 or 5 to follow the lead of Rangers Madden, Brenchley, and Leckleitner, themselves directed to search the Ojai, Kotsuk Creek, and Summerlin trails, respectively. And again, according to the reports, and that's why the phrasing is a little weird here, I would not have written it this way, Ranger Hall was given the assignment to provide containment on the White River Road from the White River Campground, Highways 410 and 123, to the Stevens Canyon Road entrance, while Ranger Naring began to interview family members at the trailhead. And it did not take long for potentially valuable information to come to light. Chet's parents told Naring that their son was an avid amateur photographer and may have been in the park to take pictures with his large format camera, but they couldn't be sure. But upon searching his car, that line of thinking seemed to be correct. It just didn't help them determine where the young man might have gone. Investigators found 4 8x10-inch photo negatives in the car, apparently taken with Chet's 35-pound, 15-inch long, 14-inch wide camera. It's hard to say exactly what model this was, as I can't find any examples that match those exact dimensions, but that is a type of camera that is apparently not uncommon amongst hobbyist photographers. I'm sure that editor Aiden has found a number of examples and popped them on the screen at this point. Now, whatever that camera was, it wasn't in the car, but Chet's house keys, some change, a few audio tapes, a glasses case, and some miscellaneous papers were, but none of that helped them to identify where Chet might have been going or why. At least, not anything that the car's location and the missing camera couldn't. The most simple explanation was that he'd struck out up the Ojai Lakes Trail to take those pictures and had gotten stuck somewhere along the way. And if I'm pronouncing Ojai wrong, tell me how to pronounce it. This one definitely is causing me trouble. Now, if that were the case and Chet was stuck somewhere along the trail, searchers would have expected to find some sign of his whereabouts between the trailhead and the White River, or potentially up Needle Creek. But as rangers with bloodhounds and teams of volunteers made their way into the various trails leading away from Chet's car, neither he nor his bulky camera turned up. That didn't mean hope was lost, though, as the weather had been clear overnight and continued to be into the morning of Friday, November 14th, 1997. That was a blessing for both the searchers and the missing man, as it meant that the worst of his worries would have been the chilly temperatures over the night since he disappeared. Still, that was a very legitimate concern, as Chief Ranger John Crambrink told the Olympian that Chet was really only prepared for a day hike. Now, it was not an insurmountable, unsurvivable challenge, but it wasn't a walk in the park either. In a literal sense, of course, it was a walk in the park, but one of the major problems was determining in just which direction that walk had been. According to Ranger Stevens, it was not possible to find a foot track to identify as Hansen's because there were many people who had been going out on the trail during the night. Now, this is not an uncommon problem in missing persons cases, and it's one of the more poorly understood reasons for SAR teams to insist that search parties wait until a proper effort is underway. What little they could wager on came from Chet's parents, who informed the Rangers that Chet had been focusing on waterfalls and general water shots in his recent work. And that meant that he was probably attempting to reach one of the falls up Kotsuk or Needle Creeks. He also may have just been there to photograph deer falls near the trailhead, but if that were the case, then he likely wouldn't have gotten lost in the first place. On the other hand, it would have tracked with his other photography from the day, as the two negatives that didn't turn out black when developed showed shots of Tipsu Lake and Mount Rainier taken from or near the highways. Alternatively, he may have just made those shots quickly because he wanted to spend most of his time somewhere else in the park, such as Kotsuk Creek. The problem was that he didn't seem to be anywhere along the trails, creeks, or ridges going up the Ojai Lakes Trail. 14th saw more bloodhounds and a helicopter join the search, but even though the dogs picked up a scent trail heading up that way on the previous day, none of the 6 canines on the scene on Friday managed to pick it back up, and the helicopter came up empty as well. Despite the defeats of the first 2 days, the effort pressed on into Saturday, with more than 100 searchers, including family, friends, and co-workers from Alaska Airlines, scouring the mountain for any sign of the missing photographer. But none came, and the same was true of the following day's search on the 17th. Chet Hansen was gone, and nobody had any idea where he might have been. Rangers had called hospitals, searched every trail they believed accessible from the parking area, and had put notices to be on the lookout for the 5-foot 10-inch tall, 170-pound 27-year-old. And yet all of it came to nothing. They kept the search in a suspended, be-on-the-lookout state, but after 4 days of intensive searches, nobody expected Chet to have survived. If anything, the most confusing part may have well been that nobody had found his body, or at least his camera. He wasn't on any of the trails, which meant that he'd either never been there to begin with, despite what the dogs thought they might have smelled, or that he'd intentionally gone off the beaten path in order to take a picture. As far as anyone could tell, Chet had taken photos at Tipsu Lake and Cayuse Pass early on the morning of the 11th, and then immediately hit the Ojai Lakes Trail, and it seemed that somewhere along the way, he just vanished into thin air. But that narrative would change when a witness came forward in April of 1998. On the 30th of that month, Ranger Depiriak, and man, these are some names, aren't they, spoke to a Willard O. Olson Jr., who believed that he had seen Hansen on November 11th. Ranger Stevens followed up by phone, and in the course of that interview learned of details which made Chet's disappearance all the more bizarre. You see, as Olson recalled, he and his girlfriend had just reached the top of Shriner Peak around noon that day, and were sitting down for lunch when a man matching Hansen's description came up the trail. He was wearing long beige or khaki-colored cotton pants, a light beige-colored cotton windbreaker-type jacket, and tennis shoes, Stevens reported. And unfortunately, in this case, his parents did not recall what he had been wearing on the day he went missing. He wore no backpack, was carrying only a medium-sized shoulder bag and a bottle of water, and was visibly wet with sweat from the hike up the mountain. Olson did not remember seeing the man take any pictures. In fact, he didn't even remember seeing a camera, but he did say that the man who might have been Chet was carrying a device around in his hand and taking readings. Olson couldn't positively identify what the device was, but he offered the suggestion that it might have been a GPS or a light reader. And shortly after he finished his readings, the very beige man turned to head back down the trail to the parking lot, passing another hiker who was on the way up. While Olson didn't report speaking to the man he believed was Chet beyond exchanging pleasantries, he did have a conversation with the second hiker, who confirmed that he had passed that same man on his way up. Unfortunately, Olson did not get the other hiker's name, but he was able to confirm that when he and his girlfriend reached the trailhead at dusk, theirs was the only car in the parking lot. Now, this kind of threw a wrench into the most simple explanation regarding Chet's disappearance, which would have been that he had taken his 2 pictures at Tipsu and Cayuse, and then hit the Ojai Lakes Trail, where he eventually wandered off to take a picture and either got lost or severely injured. Because if that was him on Shriner Peak, he would not have had much daylight to attempt another hike by the time he made it down. Even though he was reportedly a strong hiker who had spent a lot of time in the park and knew the area well, the trail to Shriner Peak is 4 miles with an elevation gain of 3,400 feet. All Trails estimates that going up and coming back down takes about 6.5 hours, and it's pretty evenly split between the way up and the way down. By the time he made it back to the parking lot, it would have been between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m., and on the east side of Mount Rainier, the sun sets even earlier than it does for the rest of western Washington. The earliest data I could find for Rainier's sunset was from 2005, and that had the sunset at that time of year, in fact on that specific day in 2005, listed as being at 4:38 p.m. with civil twilight around 5:09 p.m. That's a problem, because in order to reach the first waterfall worth photographing along the Ojai Lakes Trail, he would need to hike 1.5 miles up 712 feet of elevation, a trek All Trails estimates to be about 1.5 hours. Even if Hansen reached the Shriner Peak trailhead at 3:30, it would be getting dark by the time he even reached Sydney Falls, let alone by the time he set up his camera and picked a shot. Even a hobbyist photographer like him would have known that wasn't a good idea, and Chet should have been doubly aware that attempting to hike was a bad plan given his experience in the park. The timing also suggests that Hansen shouldn't have made an attempt to go further than the falls, because doing so would have meant traveling down in the dark, all the way down, and most likely part of the way up. And even if he had made such a mistake, one would think that he'd have started making his way back down at some point rather than going off trail somewhere to take a picture. He might still have gone off trail accidentally, but then it should have been relatively easy to find his way back, given that the trail runs parallel to the creek from the trailhead to the falls. And if he'd become injured that close to the trailhead, then he almost certainly would have been found in those first 24 hours. Of course, it's possible that the man Olsen saw wasn't Hansen at all, or that Olsen made up the story for some reason, but that only removes one aspect of the mystery. Even if Chet didn't summit Shriner Peak that day, he's still never been found. While no papers reported this to be the case, I don't think it's beyond reason that the Rangers might have considered that Chet's disappearance was deliberate. There was no reporting regarding what his life was like back home, but if he was living with his parents at 27, it's probably safe to say that he wasn't raking in the cash. So, starting over somewhere new could have seemed appealing. That said, it's hard to speculate because we know so little, and considering how many family members, friends, and coworkers came out looking for him, it doesn't seem like he was wanting for human connection. So, would he really just disappear without telling anyone? I struggle to believe that. Now, it also wouldn't be out of the question that the Rangers genuinely did just miss him during their search, especially if he'd been incapacitated or had died. It wouldn't be the first time it's happened in a place like Mount Rainier, and honestly, that would seem like the most likely circumstance. But then there's the case of Karen Sykes. Karen Sykes lived to hike, and I mean that very literally. As a writer with the Seattle Post-Intelligencer for many years, 70-year-old Karen was the author of a weekly column called Trail of the Week, through which she published countless articles about the trails surrounding her home in the Pacific Northwest. In addition to that, she frequently did freelance writing for other local publications and had published a book entitled Hidden Hikes of Western Washington. She had been an avid hiker since at least her mid-30s, and on June 18, 2014, she was out yet again on another writing-focused excursion. This time a freelance piece for the tourism website Visit Rainier. Her companion on that hike was her boyfriend, a man by the name of Bob Morthorst, with whom she'd had many similar excursions over the course of their relationship. According to news reports on the story, it was Bob who was the last to see her alive, and he was also the one who reported her missing late that night. Much the same as with Chet Hansen's case, there are unfortunately very few details about Karen's disappearance, with most of the reporting focused on the search efforts over the 3 days which followed. What we do know is that Karen and Bob were in the Ojai Lakes area on the evening of June 18th, that they separated, and that when Karen didn't return as planned, Bob went down the mountain to file the report. And that leaves quite a few gaps in the narrative. There's no reporting on what time the couple started their hike, or what time they separated, how long they expected to be apart, or what time Bob turned around to head back. We do know that Karen was carrying camping equipment, but only enough supplies for one night, that she and Bob separated at about 5,000 feet in elevation, and that he reported her missing by phone around 10:30 p.m. on the 18th. Now, for this story, there is no case file to work of, no detailed descriptions of search procedures, or really anything of value in that regard. In fact, there were really only 2 reasons that I decided to give this one a deeper look: the proximity to Chet Hansen's disappearance, and the rather confusing state and location in which her remains were found on the afternoon of June 22nd. And I was also a little hesitant to cover this case due to the family's acceptance of the possibility that she'd simply gotten lost while hiking off trail. But I also couldn't really ignore how unusual it is, and if I do end up causing any offense or pain, I hope they know that that was not my intention, and I apologize. You see, this is one of those found in a place that didn't make sense kinds of stories. If you're familiar with our work here at the Lore Lodge, then you've probably heard me talk about the disappearance and subsequent recovery of Jim McGrogan, one of the more peculiar cases in the Missing 411 portfolio, if not completely inexplicable in a technical sense. What I mean by that is that Jim ended up in a place that was accessible from where he was last seen, but the decisions he must have made to get there seemed to defy rationality. The same can be said about Karen, except for the fact that her body was recovered from a location that makes even less sense than that of Jim McGrogan's. Jim was found at the bottom of a cliff miles to the east of where he should have been, but that cliff was certainly accessible from where he was last seen. Karen, on the other hand, went missing in an area where the surrounding ridgelines are over 500 feet taller than the elevation where she was last seen, at their lowest point. And that spot is very obviously uphill from the trail, which, as we noted in the previous chapter, follows along Kotsuk Creek. But they didn't find Karen along Kotsuk Creek, and they didn't find her along Shaw Creek, which runs on the northern side of the Ojai Lakes area, either. No. Karen Sykes was found halfway down the hillside above Boundary Creek, on the wrong side of the ridge, in what Mount Rainier National Park spokeswoman Patty Wald described as a cross-country area, an area where people normally don't go, marked by very steep, very rough terrain. Now, there is precedent for Karen going off trail on purpose. She was, after all, the author of a best-selling guide to the least tracked pathways in the Pacific Northwest, and had photographed places where few have gone except by looking with binoculars or following contour lines on a map. The problem is that in order to reach the place in which she was found, she'd have to break every single rule of both hiking and common sense. Let's go over the facts. According to the Kitsap Sun, Karen and Bob started their hike from the southern trailhead in the same location that it appeared Chet Hansen had, and they separated about 4 miles in, so it should have taken them about 2.5 to 3 hours to reach that point according to all trails. This sort of separation was apparently not unusual for Karen, as her daughter told NBC that her mother would often trek ahead to a more difficult part of the trail to take photos, and Bob would wait for her to return. When she didn't return this time, searchers assumed that she must have continued up the trail and ultimately gotten lost, stuck, or injured, and so they focused their efforts on the area between the two trailheads. That area is a valley between two ridges, which at their lowest points are still over 6,000 feet, and at their highest soar to over 6,600. The valley floor, meanwhile, sits at a little over 5,000 feet. The trail itself climbs up to just over 5,200 feet and runs entirely north-south until it reaches Kotsuk Creek, which it then follows all the way down to the parking lot near Deer Creek Falls. This means that somebody lost in the area would need only the sun to navigate back to Kotsuk Creek, and from there, all they'd have to do to reach the parking lot is head downhill. Given Karen's decades of experience, it's hard to imagine that she could have truly gotten lost so long as she remained lucid. A hiker of that caliber, and especially one with camping gear, would also know that the best thing to do if lost in such an area would be to stay put and await rescue. Karen was not alone out there. She had the equipment to survive a night in the woods, and she should have known that help would be on the way by morning. Even if she ignored all of the best practices, then she still should have been able to tell which way was south, and no matter where she was when she realized she was lost, she would have eventually reached the creek and therefore been back on the trail in some sense or another, so long as she kept going downhill. She was simply too experienced and well-equipped to make such a devastating error as to climb over a ridge away from both the trail and the potential search area. And that's not just my assessment either. On June 20th, NBC News reported that Visit Rainier Executive Director Mary Kay Nelson, a friend of Karen's, said that if anybody can survive the wilderness, it's her, and that Karen is what I would consider an utmost expert, and Mount Rainier is her backyard. Kim Brown, a hiking partner, told Oregon Live that Karen was very careful and very cautious. The Kitsap Sun quoted an email from Lola Kemp, a close friend who planned to hike with Sykes that weekend, as saying that Karen was the guru of trails, hiking twice a week and experienced in climbing and scrambling, and that she would find it difficult to imagine that she would get lost. Kemp, for her part, felt that it was more likely that Karen was injured and waiting perhaps impatiently to be rescued. Now, the same paper quoted Greg Johnston, another outdoors writer for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, as saying that Karen was the last person anyone would expect to get lost, particularly on Mount Rainier, and that if anybody can survive, it's her. Everywhere you look, people were confident that Karen was not the type to make the kind of mistakes that her recovery location would suggest she had. The one person who didn't have anything to say to the press was Bob Morthorst, her boyfriend and the last person to see her alive. The story he'd given the Rangers, who in turn gave it to the Sun, was that he had stopped for a lunch break about 400 feet below the pass beneath Barrier Peak, while Karen told him that she wanted to continue on ahead and that she'd be back in an hour, and that she'd catch up to him as he made his way down the trail. Depending on when they stopped for lunch, that means that they separated anywhere from 6 to 10 hours before Bob reported her missing, and that he didn't report her missing until an hour and a half after sunset and nearly an hour after civil twilight. One could argue that he waited in order to make sure she didn't come back to an empty parking lot, but there are 2 ranger stations within 10 miles of the trailhead. When she wasn't back by 7 or 8, he could have made his way to either one and been back within half an hour. He also could have attempted to climb back up the trail towards their point of separation to see if he ran into her, so why did he wait until 10:30 at night to file the report? I'm not saying that he had something to do with her disappearance, but his decision-making definitely leaves some questions. And so does Karen's, if we're to believe that she ended up above Boundary Creek because she got lost. When she and Bob separated, she would have been traveling west and north within the canyon towards the Oahe Lakes. How did she end up nearly due east? There's also a difference in reporting between some sources, with most saying she was recovered halfway down the hill above Boundary Creek, while the Kitsap Sun reported that she was found in the eastern branch. Either one would be difficult to get to by accident, given the need to climb over at least 500 feet uphill to the north when she should have been going downhill into the south, but the eastern branch would mean that she'd actually crossed Boundary Creek at some point rather than just following it downhill once she got there. It also tells us, as the coroner later confirmed, that she did not fail to return to the trail due to injury or exhaustion, because she clearly had the energy to scramble over the ridge and down into the Boundary Creek drainage. Such a decision could have been the result of the hypothermia which ended her life, as delusions can set in as this condition worsens, but when did she become hypothermic? It seems unlikely that it would have been on that first day. Sure, it was cold at that elevation, but she was dressed for that. Her friends and colleagues also told the press and the Rangers that she was always very well prepared, and she had equipment and food to camp for the night. She wasn't injured, and she only intended to go on for another half hour before turning back, which wouldn't even take her all the way to the pass beneath Barrier Peak. If she'd gotten lost, it almost certainly should have been possible to tell which direction she needed to go, considering that direction was, again, simply downhill with the sun to her right and behind her. If for some reason she was too tired to do that, then she absolutely would have been too tired to go uphill, and she most likely would have chosen to camp wherever she was. Rangers and mountain rescue squads were on the ground first thing in the morning, and they brought a helicopter with them. She would have at least heard it, and probably could have seen it. If she was indeed above the tree line, then she'd have stuck out like a sore thumb on the snow-covered ground, so long as she walked into an open area. But the only way it really makes sense for her to have gone to Boundary Creek is if she did it that first night. But again, that would go against every single piece of wisdom, instinct, and common sense she possessed, and therefore only makes sense if she somehow lost all critical thinking skills. Or maybe she was never on the Oahe Lakes Trail at all. If they'd gone up Boundary Creek rather than following the trail, then her location makes perfect sense, but it also kind of throws Morthorst's entire story out the window. Then again, she had no injuries, so what could he possibly have done? People don't typically just lay down and die of exposure for no reason, and if she'd suffered an accident of some kind, then what point would there be in fabricating the story about going up the trail and her disappearing? And where were her supplies and camping gear? They aren't mentioned in any of the articles I could find, but that could have just been an oversight by the writers. If it wasn't, though, then what happened to them? The biggest questions with Karen's case are how, when, and why she ended up on the wrong side of the ridge between Barrier Peak and Buell Peak. The how, it would seem, must have been by climbing over the ridge. I feel as though the when must have been the first day, because the helicopter would have informed her that people were looking for her, and she was smart enough to stay in the search area if she knew rescue was on its way. As for the why, from what I've seen, there's just no conceivable reason for her to have gone that way unless she was running away from something. But what? A mountain lion would have caught her. The bear probably would have too, if it even bothered to chase her. To be honest, when I started researching this case, I felt like it had to be a simple answer like Morthorse doing something to her, but unless the coroner missed something major on autopsy, and one was performed, then I'm not sure how he could have ensured that she didn't make it. And besides, what motive would he have? The more I look into it, the more unusual this case becomes, and by extension, so too does the case of Chet Hansen nearly 20 years earlier. That said, one thing does come to mind, and as much as I really, genuinely hate to say it, it involves Sasquatch, though not in the way you might be expecting. Before you start typing comments or looking for the unsubscribe button, I'm not suggesting that Sasquatch kidnapped either Chet or Karen. I'm not even suggesting Sasquatch, as most people understand the term, exists. What I am saying is that one particular aspect of the legitimate Native American folklore regarding the original Sasquatch legends came to mind as I was writing the previous chapter. You see, across the Pacific Northwest, and in particular in the Northern Cascades, the natives have legends about tribes of large, hairy wild men, which they refer to as Saskets or Seahtiks, or some other similar term. It's actually from Saskets that we get Sasquatch, and while almost all indigenous Sasquatch legends involve the hairy men living in caves, one told by Jorg Totsky of the Klallam tribe seems particularly prescient to these two missing persons cases. Now, I'll let you know off the bat that there's way more to it than what I'm about to tell you, but we already have two very long videos about native Sasquatch stories that cover all of this and more. To be honest, I think they're some of my best work, so if you want the rundown, I suggest taking a look at them. I'll link them in the description for ease of access. As for the part of the legend which is applicable to the disappearances of Chet Hansen and Karen Sykes, it's about the experiences of one Henry Napoleon, as retold by Jorg Totsky for the July 15, 1924 issue of the Oregonian. In the wake of the Ape Canyon incident, yeah, like I said, you should watch the Sasquatch videos we did, Totsky provided Napoleon's account in order to explain what his people actually believed about Sasquatch, and to give something of a first-hand account of an encounter with them. According to Totsky, these Seahtiks were at least 7 feet tall, though they could grow as tall as 8 feet, and their bodies were covered in hair like a bear. He also says that they didn't hunt using weapons, but rather hypnosis and paralysis, and that they were also skilled ventriloquists who were able to throw their voice all over the place. The most important part, however, was with regard to where they lived, and he said that they lived in the mountains. Now, I need to be clear about what that means. When you hear in the mountains, you're probably thinking that they lived amongst the mountains. And that is not what he meant. Totsky, citing Napoleon as an eyewitness, was saying that they live in the mountains, as in they lived in the cave systems beneath the surface, like in The Descent, or like in the mines in Lord of the Rings. Now, while there are quite a few of these accounts, all of them covered in our Sasquatch series, Henry Napoleon's story in particular mentions one detail which got me thinking. He said that he was out hunting near Duncan, Vancouver Island, British Columbia, when he came across what at first he believed to be a large bear. And one thing that's very common in these narratives is that bears and Sasquatches get mixed up all the time. Hey, you can make a book series out of this. Anyway, he did what one does while hunting and raised his rifle to shoot, but just before he pulled the trigger, what he moments earlier thought to be a bear stood up, turned, and spoke to him in his own Klallam language. It asked him to come over for dinner. Being a go-with-the-flow kind of guy, Henry agreed to come back to the Squatch Cave for a meal of whatever it is that Sasquatches eat on the average Tuesday night. You may be surprised to find out that this is where it connects to the disappearances we covered in this episode. I say this because in Henry's story, the hairy giant led him down a trail through the woods until they reached an underground trail, which led to the dwelling place of the Seahtik tribe deep within the mountain. Once inside, he met the rest of the tribe, and he reported that they treated him with courtesy, were kind to him, and provided anything he needed. And most importantly, and this is the part where I promise everything comes together, they told him about their way of life. In particular, they told him that they spent their winters on Vancouver Island in various cave systems where they slept like bears, something I assume was Napoleon's way of saying that they spent the winter hibernating. And when the spring came, they would begin to migrate. But not in the way we typically think of migration, because they did it underground. To be clear, he doesn't explicitly say that they traveled underground, but the way it's described in the story comes across as though they spent at least a few portions of their journey traveling through cave systems. And where did this migration take them? Well, according to the story, they would come out at, you guessed it, Mount Rainier. From there, they'd go off to Mount St. Helens, then up to the Olympic Range, and then back across the Sound to their winter quarters on Vancouver Island. But the important part is that bit about coming out of the mountains at Mount Rainier. I want to reiterate that I'm not saying I think Bigfoot kidnapped either Chet Hansen or Karen Sykes. What I am getting at is the possibility that their disappearances are the result of ill-fated, unplanned attempts to explore yet unmapped caves in the area. It would be silly to say that we can rely on stories like Henry Napoleon's to be the full, unadulterated truth, but his story is not the only one to mention people living in or traveling through cave systems in the mountains of Washington and British Columbia. In my experience, there is a kernel of truth to most folktales, and the more often one aspect is repeated in varying stories from different groups of people, the more likely it is that it's based in reality to some extent. Is it a little out there? Sure. Is it possible? I think so. Did I want an excuse to talk about Native American Bigfoot legends since all we've done recently is missing persons cases? Perchance. That said, I don't think it's all that absurd a suggestion to say that Chet and Karen could have ended up underground for at least long enough to disorient them. I wouldn't necessarily say that's the most likely option, but then again, I don't see any of the other explanations as particularly bulletproof either. I especially don't like the conclusion that Karen somehow made every single wrong decision possible in order to end up in an absurd location given where she started. It is possible that she suffered some sort of mental break or had a stroke that the coroner missed, or that they were never hiking on the Ojai Lakes Trail to begin with, or even that Karen really did make decisions that were completely out of character. But no matter what possibility you go with, there are a number of unanswered questions. As for Chet, he was much younger and a less experienced hiker, but if Olson's story is true and Hansen was at the top of Shriner Peak a little after noon, I have a hard time believing that someone with his photography experience would go to the trouble of lugging a 35-pound film camera up a trail when he knew it would be dark before he got set up. Is it possible that he did make that choice? Yes. It's also possible that Olson was wrong or that he was lying. And it could be that Chet got up there at a reasonable hour, went off trail to get a good picture, and then in some way or another ended up incapacitated in an area that went unnoticed by the search teams. If there was snow on the ground up there in June of 2014, then we can safely assume that there was even more of it on the ground in November of 1997. And that means it would have been much easier to lose the trail. And since so many people walked the area before the official search started, it was reportedly impossible to determine which prints were Chet's. And then, of course, there is the possibility that he intended to disappear and that, even his family might have helped him with this. But again, actually, the more I think about it, the more that does make a little bit of sense, because his family seemed oddly at peace with his disappearance after only a few days. But that was also according to the papers, which were not particularly detailed. In any case, this is one of the weirder sets of cases that I've looked at, and I think I've netted out at the belief that it is possible that they're connected, doubtful that they're paranormal, and unlikely that they'll ever really be solved. If there is a connection, I think it lies within the potential of getting lost in an unknown cave system, which is the kind of place that would attract both a young photographer and an elderly hiking writer who focuses on lesser-known trails and paths. That said, I'd be hard-pressed to say anything with certainty, other than that I really don't see a good explanation for how Karen got to where she was found. Something just doesn't sit right about that one in particular. I should also mention that we'd love to cover something other than missing person stories now and then, so if you guys would like to see more paranormal, folklore, or other such content, please let us know by commenting your requests for video topics. The more descriptive you can be, the better, and if you can provide us source names, I'll be able to give everything a look. Unfortunately, we are still bound by the almighty algorithm, which just deranked our last video from doing really well to really not well for absolutely no reason, and YouTube doesn't like to actually, discuss anything with us. So if you'd like to help us get to the point where we can just kind of ignore it without going bankrupt, you can support us directly by subscribing on Patreon. It's just $1 a month, and the more of you we have over there, the more help we can hire, and the more we'll be able to branch out on subject matter, and then the more time I can put into making the content you guys really love, and not just the stuff YouTube wants us to produce, which we're still really not even sure what that is. You can also check out our merch at Bunker Branding, or even get our coffee, Mount Pocono Perk, through Tableau Roasting Company. Both are linked in the description, as are Patreon and our Discord server, which is the best place to get updates on new videos, projects, and our live shows, which run Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern unless they don't, and if they don't, we'll tell you. You can also catch recordings of those live shows here on YouTube and on all podcast platforms the Wednesday after the show, and don't forget to check out our channels like the Weird Bible, History Unhinged, and my personal channel, Aiden Mattis. Last but not least, I'd like to thank Holtzkern once again for sponsoring this video. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.